Welcome to part one of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation's program, Why is Contemporary Anti-Semitism So Sexy? A unique psychological analysis with our special guest, Dr. David Nussbaum. Thank you for coming out this evening to the Lodger Center congregation, and a big thank you to the synagogue for partnering with CAEF both today and on all CAEF programs. And thanks to everyone who has joined us virtually as well. CAEF welcomes partners and co-sponsors, and we thank the following organizations for helping to promote this program: the Institute for Studies in Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, the Lawfare Project, End Jew Hatred Canada, the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, European Lawyers for Israel, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, Israel Activist Calendar, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, the Mattathias Project, Cherut Canada, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, Beth Tikva Synagogue, Doctors Against Racism and Anti-Semitism, Americans for a Safe Israel, and JTeach. CAEF is a nationally registered charitable organization with a wide reach, and we appreciate having other organizations reach out to partner with us to suggest shared programs, to support advocacy positions when needed, and to stand loud and proud with Israel. All donations are tax deductible, and while we operate with a small budget, funds are necessary for our operation. So if you're Canadian, please donate online at www.caef.ca, and if American, please send funds to our partner, the Lawfare Project, and indicate funds are for End Jew Hatred Canada, which is a joint initiative. It's my distinct pleasure now to introduce Dr. David Nussbaum, who is a distinguished academic and a longtime friend of CAEF. In May, I enjoyed a lunch with David and his wife in Jerusalem and learned that he would be back in Toronto for a few weeks, giving lectures at various professional meetings. So I persuaded him to propose a unique topic for CAEF, and indeed he has done that. This topic will be presented in two parts, with tonight's topic being Anti-Semitism as Extremism, Background and Basics. Dr. David Nussbaum received his PhD in biological psychology from the University of Waterloo and is a registered psychologist in the areas of clinical, forensic, and neuropsychology. He served as staff psychologist, then senior psychologist at the Metropolitan Toronto Forensic Service at the Clark Institute of Psychiatry. He then became a full-time research psychologist at the forensic program of the Whitby Mental Health Centre, now known as Ontario Shores. For over 20 years, Dr. Nussbaum taught psychology at York University, and then for 8 years, he taught at the Scarborough campus of the University of Toronto in both psychology and law, as well as in psychopharmacology. He is an elected fellow of both the Canadian and American Psychological Associations and was awarded the International Achievement Award of the APA Division on Advancement of Psychopharmacology. And he has chaired both the Criminal Justice System section and the section for the study of extremism and terrorism. David has taught as a visiting professor at other universities and served on the Ontario Review Board. He founded the Ellen K. Hess Institute for Integrative and Forensic Behavioral Science in 2016 and served as its president and director of research until 2022. On the international stage, David has held guest professorships at the China University of Beijing, delivered lectures at Kenya's Annual Psychological Society, and at conferences in the US, Belgium, Sweden, Finland, Israel, Germany, and Japan. He is currently a senior research scholar with the Institute for Studies in Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. David will now present part one of his presentation, after which he will take questions from the audience, both in the room here and on Zoom. If you wish to share comments on chat, please indicate where you are and be respectful with your comments for those watching virtually. Questions for David can be posted on the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, and those in the room, we will bring a mic to you when we get to the question period. Tonight's program is being recorded and will be made available to everyone registered. So now over to David.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank Andrea and CAEF for their help in seeing that this evening was possible, and I could share some ideas that I've shared with some colleagues working on anti-Semitism and some in academia, not only in Canada, Israel, also in Greece. It's really a pleasure to be back in Canada. I love this country, and as I've said to people, I lived here for 72 years, and in 72 years, I've experienced exactly 2 anti-Semitic incidents personally, and I think for a country, despite what some politicians may say, Canada is not a racist country. And I think those of us who have lived here can say that. It's not that there are no anti-Semites here. There are anti-Semites everywhere. But the scourge of anti-Semitism did not greatly infect Canada, and certainly not since the mid-40s. Individuals, yes. Painful incidents, yes, but it was not the country since after the Second World War. So what I want to do tonight is something that's a little different. CAEF has put on some absolutely great webinars that are very informative. What I'm going to try to do tonight is to give us a different way of conceptualizing and thinking about anti-Semitism from a psychological perspective that is somewhat unique, because I've been a critic of psychology and its methods. So I'm going to start off, here, just a sec, never mind the abstract. This is what I'm going to try to do tonight. So there are 2 parts. The first is A, and I will, that is the necessary philosophical and psychological fundamentals of how I believe people process information. And it is intended for an intelligent lay audience. And I respect the intelligence of everybody here, and hopefully everybody who has joined us on Zoom. There is nothing technical that I don't provide some background for. So I think that you're all more than capable of understanding, even when I talk about some very basic neuroscience. So we'll go through that. Some of the, I will explain some of why I look at psychology differently than most psychologists. And that leads up to what I think is necessary to understand the basics of the information processing that leads to extremism and anti-Semitism. And once that is done, points 1 through 5, which you can read on the screen faster than I can recite them, then we'll go into things that are a little more focused on extremism and why I see anti-Semitism as a special case. It is a not just another case, a special case that is unique in extremism. And so then where this is all leading to is how anti-Semitism spreads. What is the psychology? What are the psychological mechanisms used by anti-Semites, which are really not that different? Again, a specific case, but basically, this is the same type of techniques that extremists use in other forms of extremism. And I guess the troublesome thing is that there are some very unique factors that seem to only attach to anti-Semitism, where other extremists don't, they fear to tread. Okay, so that's what I hope to accomplish tonight. And then next week from Israel, I hope to share what the 3 major threats are to not only Jewish survival, but survival of the West as we know it. The traditional Judeo-Christian ethics and where it's coming from, and how these three forces today come together, even though they share virtually no ideological points. So that's where I hope to go in these two talks. So, okay, that's next week. So we start out with what is truth? And we will see why this is important in understanding extremism towards the end of the talk tonight. So one approach, this is from a paper by Chin. I have the reference up here on the top. And when you get the slides, if anybody is interested in any of the references, they're here. So you can read them and see whether I've misinterpreted them or completely missed the point or whatever, but I try to be faithful to it. Anyway, the first is consensus theory. And that is where people believe that if this is the popular opinion, that's truth. And I think that approach for people who really cared about reality went out the window when Columbus got back from the New World, because until that happened, the consensus was the world was flat. And then he didn't fall off the edge, and he returned. And so people flipped, and the consensus was that the Earth was a sphere. So now that's the consensus, but it's not true because that's what people believe. And we will get into more sophisticated versions of what truth is. So the second is pragmatic theory. Whatever is useful and beneficial is true. So there are some intrinsic limitations to this. First of all, useful and beneficial to whom? Shouldn't be who, to whom. And B, many things work in the short run, but they don't work in the long run. And so a lot of things in science, people believed for X number of years, and then cases contradicted it, and they had to change their beliefs, and on the basis of new evidence. So pragmatic theory is not ultimately the truth. Then there's correspondence theory. Truth corresponds to observable reality, and that goes beyond just what works. But there is the notion that if you come across a case where what you think is true is not true, then it no longer is true, and you have to reconceptualize what your view of truth is. And the fourth is coherence theory, that claims that follow logical rules of inference based on axioms or intermediate propositions are true. And that is, you started if then, and you have a conclusion. But what if the if is not true? And so sometimes axioms or intermediate propositions may not be true. And so if you only follow the logic, but you don't subject the logic to some form of empirical validation, or more importantly, invalidation, then you don't know whether it's true or not. And what science tries to do is to, as we'll see in a minute, tries to combine the last two, but I'll get to that, as I said, in a minute. I just want to talk very briefly about the difference between nature, science, and technology. So nature is what exists out there in the world, whether it's the climate, the weather, the trees, animals, laws of physics. They are out there in the world. And they, as King Solomon said, Ein chadash tachas hashemesh, there's nothing new that has happened since way back when. But science changes because science is how scientists conceptualize and explain the reality. And so before Newton came along, nature was exactly the way it is today. There may have been some changes due to changes in conditions, but the sun rose in the morning. People who got this, that, or the other disease had the symptoms and may have survived or not. But the way physicians have understood the body and different diseases over the years, that has changed, because science is how humans understand nature. Technology is using science for human benefit, ideally. But for those of you who are familiar with Tom Lehrer's song about Wernher von Braun, he says, once the rockets go up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. And so technology can be used for good, but it can also be used for evil. And that's, I think, goes right back to the beginning of humanity, where God instructed Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, about the Eitz Hadas, the tree of knowledge, good and bad. So how you use things, that's a whole different issue. That's where ethics and morality come in. Anyway, so this is pretty much a repeat. And the question is, how do we find truth? How is truth discovered? So Karl Popper, who is a prominent philosopher, he came up with this notion of logical positivism. And Popper said that you can never prove anything in science. And the argument was based on the notion that you can come up with a theory and you can do an experiment, and the prediction is upheld, except you can never rule out that maybe there were other intervening steps that actually caused it, and not the independent variable that you manipulated to start the process. So in Popper's, so what happened as a result of Popper's arguments was that the nature of at least biological sciences and the social sciences changed, and we have what is now called inferential statistics, where you set an experiment up with an scientific or experimental hypothesis, and then the null hypothesis. The two things aren't related, and you can reject the null hypothesis based on the empirical results. And if you reject the null, the thing that you don't believe, then you can accept the alternate hypothesis. But that is how, that's where all the statistics have made their way into journals. And it works, except it has its limitations also. But the idea is, as you see here in this spiral, that when an area of research starts, we're going around this spiral, and we're rejecting things that we learn are false. And with every rotation, or revolution, it gets a little closer to the truth, closer and closer. And I think there are some things in science that are never going to be challenged. I don't think anybody in 100 years or 1,000 years, if the world lasts that long, will come up with some finding and say, no, it's not the heart that pumps blood, it's the kidneys, or it's the liver, or it's the ear. I think, there's enough direct observation and evidence for that, and nobody's going to disprove it. So the bottom line is that there is a reality, there is a truth. It's not always easy to discover, but it's there. And as we will see either at the end of tonight or certainly at the beginning of next week, depending on Andrea said I don't have past midnight, so I'll try to stick to that. But we will see that that's very important, because one of the things that extremists do is they redefine truth to align with their ideology. And we will see that some of the more recent extremist ideologies don't even bother with that. Anyway, So what is the consequence of disregarding truth? And what I have up here is, and actually my nephew who's into computer graphics and other things did this for me in about 4 minutes, and it would have taken me at least a week and a half. So thanks to him for that. Now you have somebody who's shooting at a target. I think you can see that. So there's the target at the top of this little diagram, and a shooter with a gun. You see the little flame coming out of the nozzle of the gun, and it just misses the target by a little bit. Now, if this happens, ideologists say, my ideology is pretty good because look, it just missed the target by a little. So they go on with this idea. They don't want to replace the ideology because they're too identified with it. But that is looking at what happens in the immediate. But if we look at what happens with this projectile, the bullet or the arrow or the idea, there is a cylinder that is, where truth is contained. And as time progresses, the projectile gets farther and farther and farther away. So in the moment, it's pretty close and it's not that bad. But at time 1, time 2, time 3, you are very, very far away from truth. And that's the biggest problem, because some ideologies start out and they're just a little bit off, and the defenders say, well, if we just jimmy it a little bit, then we'll be where we should be. But the problem is, if you miss the target, it doesn't self-correct. And this graph is actually a little bit benign, because what happened, this is sort of assuming a linear path. But at time 2 or time 3 or time 4, the people who are the guardians of these ideologies, they make more errors. And so it's not linear, but then it'll start to curve. And that's how we get back to the notion today, if you believe the woke, that men can become pregnant. So that's not just a linear error, but there are many, many other errors that are built upon errors. And so I think you can see where I'm going in terms of this whole notion about mistaken ideologies and why they're so pernicious and harmful. And on the other hand, let's say somebody starts out with truth, and I am going to make the bold assumption that traditional values that roughly correspond to the 7 mitzvahs of the Noachites, do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, murder, establish a fair justice system, and a belief that there is a creator to the universe. I might be missing one there. Oh, cruelty to animals. Those are endemic to not only Judaism, not only Christianity, but to most traditional religions around the world, and even non-religious ethical systems. Now, when people start getting away from that, it ends up in a society that is draconian and dystopic and all of that. So here you have the reverse process, because you start out with the truth, and every time you make a change, you get farther and farther and farther away from the truth. So this is sort of a 3-dimensional representation of the bullet that is just missing the target in the moment. So now, how does this impact decision-making? Well, an optimal solution to a problem requires considering each of the elements that go into whatever whatever phenomenon you're trying to understand. So if you have, for example, some phenomenon A, and A is explained by B plus C minus D plus E, whatever they mean. Okay, so we have four things that go into explaining A. What if you took everything out of this equation except the minus D? And so you try to predict A by just one of the four critical factors. And it can be anything. Let's say a hockey player, you're drafting a hockey player. So ideally you want players who can skate, who are strong, who are fast, and have a mind for the game. What if you only look at one, size, and you don't care if they can skate, if they can play intelligently, if they have any skill? Well, you're not going to draft a good hockey player. And the same thing goes with anything where you're trying to understand it. If you don't take everything that is relevant into the decision process, then you're going to come up with a wrong decision. And the solution that you come up with cannot possibly be effective. And we will see how this affects ideologies a little later. Now, there is another problem, and let's say, same A equals B plus C minus D plus E. What happens if you add a whole bunch of factors to that have nothing at all to do with what really causes this phenomenon to occur? Then you started out with something that's good, but you added a bunch of factors that just pull you away from the optimal solution. And so that, again, will mess up your application, but for very, very different reasons, opposite reasons. Now, here's an illustration of that. If you only consider part of a problem, can you solve it? So can anybody here or anybody on the web tell me what that is? And I'll give you a hint. It's very famous. Okay, so you have no idea. The reason you have no idea is because you're not considering, you haven't been gifted with the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. Here's the rest of the story, and I bet you all know who this is.
Yes.
Okay, that's good.
Inferential.
Okay, so that's one out of, okay, but if, okay, you're the second person that I've done this with. I'm going to have to change things like, use Obama's forehead, whoever, Trudeau's. Yeah, So anyway, but you understand the point that I'm making. If you only consider a small part of the problem, one bit of the information, not the whole thing, it's very, very difficult. You need to be a really gifted person to be able to say, oh yeah, this is El Gioconda or Mona Lisa, however you want to refer to her. Okay, so the bottom line, now this is something from my uncle Henry Wolf, who actually was a good friend of Rabbi Shield and my father in the various internment camps where they shared time and space. And he was a mathematician, and he said PhDs should be given for making the complex simple, not for making the simple complex. And as I say here, he was my uncle by marriage, so I didn't get his math genes. All of his cousins, uncles, they all had PhDs in math or physics and things like that. So the corollary to this also is that you should not oversimplify the complex. So you don't want to take something that's pretty simple and start adding irrelevant factors to it, but you don't want to make the other error also. So we've done the sort of basic philosophy. Now I'm going to move into a little bit of psychology. And I'm going to talk about the structural problem of knowledge in psychology or epistemology, and I'm going to propose a possible solution. So first of all, there are 4 requirements of a science, and I'm not going to go through all of them in detail because there is one that is important, number 2, which is why it's bolded. But first of all, candidate sciences study phenomena reflecting natural order in the universe. So if you think you're a scientist and you study women's fashions, and you think that women's fashions or men's fashions for that matter follow some law of science, it's nonsense, because this is something that there are so many random factors and subjective choices and all of that. There's no natural law that governs any of that stuff. So if it's going to be a science, it has to follow some natural law. And the first task of the scientist is to try to understand what is the natural law that governs this particular phenomenon. But what really sets science apart, and I'll show this in a little more detail in a few slides, is the candidate science has reductionistic language for defining and ultimately explaining phenomena. And reductionistic language is used for definition, and I will explain what that means in the next slide. The others is, third is that candidate sciences mesh with adjacent sciences above and below them in the sort of tree of knowledge, because they have a language that is where higher order constructs are defined in terms of lower order constructs, and I'll show that. And there is a gatekeeper. There is the empirical gatekeeper, because sometimes people come up with really elegant, lovely, seductive theories, except they're wrong. That's not how God built the universe. So, and that is one of the reasons why some really bad ideas have very long half-lives. And the German Nobel Prize winner in physics, Werner Heisenberg, once commented that the reason that science progresses is not because brilliant young scientists come up with innovative and insightful new ideas, but rather because old scientists eventually die. Which because there are ideas that persist because they're lovely ideas, but they've been refuted decades ago, but they're still there and they're still taught. So that's if there is an empirical gatekeeper to weed out what is admitted into the corpus of science, that is how even lovely ideas can be rejected. So we'll skip that. I'm just showing you an illustration of the point I made in terms of reductionistic language. So Newton's second law of motion, probably the most famous equation in history, or second to Einstein's E equals mc squared. In the Newtonian world, force was defined by the product of mass multiplied by acceleration. So you see, first of all, force was the higher order construct, and it's a precise relationship between 2 lower order constructs, more fundamental, that are measurable. So mass in the Newtonian world is something that was not directly measured. It was indirectly measured by weight, but we won't get into the nuances there, and multiplied by acceleration. So acceleration is something that is itself a higher order construct, and defined as a change in speed divided by a change in time. So in the Newtonian world, time is also fundamental and measurable, and speed, though, is reducible to a change in distance over a change in time. But distance, length, again, in the Newtonian perspective, and time are also fundamental and measurable elements of the Newtonian world. So you see that you start up here and you define it by lower order constructs, and those by lower order constructs and lower order constructs. So, and then you can, build up from there. Work is force multiplied by the distance that the force is applied through, and power is the amount of work a machine is capable of doing in an amount of time, and so on and so forth. So that's Newtonian mechanics in a nutshell. And this is where we get to the notion that all of the sciences, there's not really different sciences. It's only one science. And if you look at the largest system that is dealt with by scientists, it's the ecosystem, because the ecosystem is huge. It has consideration about the weather, the vegetation, the minerals, and the animals, and all of that. But if you go to the next lowest level, there are organisms. So there are different organisms. There are elephants, there are whales, there are people, dogs, etc. But how do we define the organisms in terms of the organ system? So fish don't have lungs, they have gills, and they extract oxygen from water. Mammals have lungs, and we extract oxygen from the air. So we are defined by our organ systems. The organ systems, what's the difference between liver cell, lung cell, kidney cell, brain cell? The organelles that make them up are different. And then you pass from biology to chemistry, because the organelles are constructed of macromolecules, and they are defined in terms of the molecules that make them up. And then you get into the realm of physics. Molecules are constructed from atoms, subatomic particles, energy, and every few years, some physicist gets a Nobel Prize because they've come up with some more fundamental particle to explain something at a lower level. So that is the reason that we have different sciences, is because, can you imagine trying to do a PhD in science if you had to know all of that? That would be simply impossible. So people, because of our minds and I guess limitations, we can't learn that amount of material in a meaningful amount of time and still have a meaningful life, because you'd be in school till you're 150, and very few of us live that long. So we do it this way. But one of the problems of this is that nobody really understands the whole picture in detail. So each of us, at whatever level of organization we do, we're limited because we know our little area. It's like they say, PhDs are now given for knowing more and more about less and less. And that's something that I wish intellectuals, so-called intellectuals, would keep in mind. Now, the way this applies to psychology is, and I'm not going to, I'll skip a few slides. Watson, who is the father of modern psychology and behaviorism, he reacted very strongly against the psychology that was practiced in the 1800s, which he believed, with considerable justification, was overly theoretical and consisted of constructs that could not be measured. So to look at Freud with his id, ego, superego, and the various conflicts, he said that's mentalism. It's somewhere in the mind, but we can't measure it. And he saw the great success of the empirical sciences of physics, chemistry, and the beginnings of biology. And so he said, okay, I'm going to define behavior very differently, not in terms of the result of complexes and structures in the mind that are unmeasurable, but everything in psychology can only exist if we can measure it, we can observe it and measure it. And so what Watson did was he defined behavior upward, the observable actions of the organism. And he severed psychology conceptually from the brain, because behavior was not defined in terms of what's going on in the brain. And he treated the brain as a black box. It's unknowable. It's too complex, which is not the sort of the Weltanschauung of scientists. They say, hey, there's some complexity here. Let's try to understand it. So what this does is it introduces a number of problems. The first we will call circularity. And for example, and I will use an illustration from psychiatry, but also from psychology. The way schizophrenia is defined, and also Piaget's explanation for whether children of 6 years old can perform abstract reasoning problems. So schizophrenia, if you look at DSM, the way the diagnosis, the definition of different mental disorders is constructed, there are, say, 9 symptoms, and any 5 symptoms of the 9 that somebody has qualifies them for the diagnosis. Now, there is a problem with this because you could have, the simplest case, patient A has symptoms 1 through 5, patient B has 5 through 9. They're discordant on 8 of 9 criteria. They get the same diagnosis. The psychiatrist gives them the same drug or the same form of psychotherapy, and they scratch their head because it works for him and it doesn't work for her. And this is an oversimplification, because if you look at the combinations of different symptoms that you can have, it's 9 times 8 times 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. That's the number of different combinations you can have of 9 symptoms chosen 5 at a time. So it's not really terribly perplexing as to why things don't work better. I'm not saying that psychiatrists or psychologists don't help people. They do, but the system is not, doesn't make any sense at all. And psychology is no better. Piaget was a guiding light in developmental psychology, and he came up with this notion of stages, that when kids are born, they're a very primitive stage, and as every 2-3 years, they move up a stage in processing and they're able to do more things. So if you ask a Piagetian whether an average 6-year-old child can do an abstract reasoning problem, they will say no. And empirically, they are right. If you try, we're not talking about child prodigies or anything like that, but the average 6-year-old child cannot do an abstract reasoning problem. Then you ask the Piagetian, why not? And the Piagetian will say, oh, because the 6-year-old has not yet entered the cognitive stage of formal operations. Then you ask them to define the stage of formal operations. And they will say the ability to do abstract reasoning problems. So the reason that the 6-year-old can't do it is because the 6-year-old can't do it. And so what they have done is they've obscured the distinction between a reductionist explanation and the prediction process, where they can, at a very superficial descriptive level, they can predict things because that's how they define them. And so there's a conflation between an abstract description and an explanation, and these are two different things, because you can't take that anywhere below it. So what is my proposed solution? That it is that we redefine behavior not in the upwards direction, but in the reductionistic downward direction. So I think behavior would be better defined as expressed information. Now, what do I mean by that? Each of us has a huge amount of information stored in through the cells of our brains. And so we know how to walk, we know how to talk, we know 1, 2, some of us 3 languages, some people more. We know how to use a computer, we know how to drive a car, we know the route between home and work and many other places in our cities, and how to get to Hamilton or how to get to Ottawa or New York City or whatever, how to play a musical instrument, how to ride a bicycle. So all of this information is somehow stored between the neurons of the brain. And what organizes behavior is that almost all of the time, all of that information is put on hold because it's not necessary. And what is necessary is what you need for the present situation, and maybe a little bit beyond that. But this is why nobody here is wearing a bathing suit, because you knew that you were not going to the beach or the pool. You're coming to a shul, so you're dressed this way. But if you went down to Lake Ontario or your apartment pool or your backyard pool, you wouldn't be dressed like this, because you have different information that then would be called into consciousness. So information is represented or stored and processed in between neurons and perhaps other central nervous system cells like glial cells. And we have different networks to actually convey different types of information. So there are most simply like there are auditory pathways, there are visual pathways, pain pathways, and on and on and on, plus cognitive, emotional. We'll see that in a sec. And I'm not going to go into all of that, but you can have networks firing at the same frequency in say, the auditory pathways, and you will hear a sound, you get the same frequency in the visual pathways, and you see something. And exactly how consciousness differentiates, we have no idea. So, okay, so I pretty much said that. And why is, okay, so basically this is psychological space, the big picture, and I'm not going to go through all of this, except to say that perception, cognition, motivation, emotion, and decision-making and behavior, these are all very different types of information. Each has an attention system and a memory system. For example, just a quick demonstration for attention. I'm going to switch your attention now, and you will perceive something that has been there all along, but you haven't perceived it because your attention has been elsewhere. And that is that you now will feel the pressure that gravity is exerting between your thighs and hips and the chair that you're sitting on. You've been sitting on, I've been boring you for the last half hour or whatever it is, and you haven't felt it. But now that I focus your attention on it, you can feel that, right? So attention plays a major role in what gets processed, what does not get processed. There are things that will be processed sort of in the background, running in the background, but they don't get the same resources. And so they're not memorized. They don't get into memory nearly as effectively. And I'm not going to go into all of that. We don't have time. For the purposes of extremism and terrorism, there are two things that are important. One is abstraction and one is pattern recognition. So attention allocates information processing resources to some systems at the expense of others. And this is accomplished primarily through inhibition of all things that aren't relevant. And memory, okay, we won't go through all of this, but the two at the bottom, the rote memory, which is repetition, association, learning, Pavlovian conditioning, that is one way that people learn. And what this has to do, and I'm sort of jumping the gun just to show you while I'm saying this, that there is relevance. Goebbels' famous dictum, people will believe even a big lie if it's repeated often enough. And that's one of the things that we'll see next week that is a tenet of extremist persuasion tactics. And then there's immediate memory, conceptual learning, also known as depth of processing. And you know from your own experience that some things, let's say a phone number of somebody that who will provide a repair to your air conditioner, and you'll probably never see them again in your life. So that you repeat it a few times, unless you have really good visual memory. But if you do it by auditory memory, you'll have to repeat it a few times. But yet there are other things, some ideas that are, you hear them once and you don't have to repeat them because they seem to just be processed at a much deeper level and they don't need the repetition. So we have to keep this in mind as well. The difference between intelligence and wisdom. You have a lot of people who are very intelligent and yet they make some of the stupidest life decisions imaginable. And that's why you have some people who are, on IQ tests or scholastic achievement, they do well, and then they get into drugs and they destroy their lives. They are intelligent, but they're not wise. You have a lot of people who are not that academically gifted, but if somebody comes to them trying to sell them drugs, they know that this is not good in the long term, and thank you very much, but I don't do that stuff. Much wiser decision, but they're not as intelligent. So these are two different things. Motivation is a different type of information than cognitive or even emotional. And I'll explain the difference. The difference between motivation and emotion. So in the basic primary motivational or drive systems is, you see the feeding, the fight or flight, and mating. And so basically what happens in those is that time passes, and if you haven't eaten, your level of hunger and cravings go up. And they're satisfied if you eat, and then for a number of hours, you don't feel this again. So they rise and fall. They rise internally, you satisfy them externally, and they go away. And some of them we deem, okay, sorry, this is emotions. Emotions are different because emotions are typically responses. I'm not talking about people who have physiological problems like hormonal problems but those are primarily pathological. But most people do not have mood swings for no external reason. But we all respond very emotionally to things that go on around us. Some are positive, like happiness and surprise. Some are negative, fear, sadness, anger, and disgust. So, and actually there is an anatomical differentiation where the happiness, surprise, and anger are deemed to be approach emotions. So when you feel them, you want to go towards whatever, whoever is making you feel that way. And the avoidance emotions are on the right side of the brain, the right frontal lobe versus left frontal lobe. Fear, sadness, and disgust, you want to move away from things that frighten you, make you sad, or disgust you. And the one emotion that sort of crosses the barrier here is anger. And I put that in red because anger is, although it is a negatively valenced emotion, it's not, you don't feel good. Oh boy, I felt so good. I was so angry. I feel good. So it is on the negative valence side, but it is on the approach side in terms of approach and avoidance. Now, the other thing that I'll try to finish quickly is aggression systems. And there are, in the animal kingdom, there are 7 or 8 different types of aggression. In humans, it's pretty much limited to 4. Predatory aggression, which is where there is a cognitively identified actual, like realistic material gain or social gain, but there is a rationale for it. And then there's irritable aggression, which comes from frustration and anger. And they are very different because let's say the predatory aggression, that's, let's say, the mugger on the street. And so when they mug somebody, or when a lion or a tiger hunts down a zebra or a giraffe or a wildebeest, they're not angry at the prey. They have a tangible goal that's realistic, and they use the minimal amount of violence to get what they want. And so if a mugger approaches somebody on the street and says, "Give me your purse or your wallet," and you hand it over, they don't beat you up after that, because they have gotten what they want. It's cognitive, it's cool, it's not emotional. The person who, let's say in a bar, you have 2 guys and they're talking, one guy insults the other guy's girlfriend, and they've had a couple of pops, the offended party beats the heck out of the other guy and leaves him on the floor of the bar. But after the victim is unconscious, he doesn't go over and remove his wallet from his back pocket, because these are 2 different things processed by different parts of the brain and all of that. Then there's defensive aggression, which is fear related. And that's if we are being attacked, then we defend ourselves. And then there's territorial aggression, and that's more in animals, but you see it in terms of people with gangs. So here is just another one of that. Another very important aspect of this is social hierarchies. And social hierarchies exist in the animal kingdom, whereby individuals in communal groups assume positions of ultimate status to high status to moderate status, low status, and then the bottom of the barrel. And it's not discrete, but it's continuous. And so, you've heard about alpha males in gorilla colonies, chimpanzee colonies, and leadership has its privileges, and the alpha males get more food, more females, more respect. They get first crack at whatever goodies there are available. And the way that these groups are decided is by brawn. So it's largely testosterone, which makes the alpha males more muscular, more powerful, but also on the personality side, it makes them more aggressive. And they're more prone to anger because testosterone does that. And they also are very high in dopamine, which is the reinforcement neuromodulator. So they are very focused on anything that's going to make them feel good. And so that is a bad combination unless you have them and you are able to beat up all the other chimpanzees in the group. And okay, and what happens, it's very interesting because these levels of testosterone and dopamine are not immutable. And so what researchers have found over the years is that if an alpha male has a fight and beats up some lower challenger, the alpha male's testosterone levels will go up and the challengers will go down from pre-fight levels. But if the opposite happens, and this typically happens with older alpha males, the older alpha male who's defeated, their testosterone levels will fall after the defeat by as much as 80%. And the previously low status and low testosterone alpha male, nouveau alpha male, their testosterone levels will increase by up to 300%. So it's not only that it drives it, but it also responds to the outcome of conflicts. And that's one of the reasons why appeasement is not a particularly good strategy. It's not only that you reinforce the bad behavior, but it's also that you give the opponent this boost in testosterone that makes them more aggressive. And that's why they don't say, oh, okay, I won this, and that's the end of it. No, I won this and I want more. And I'm going to get it by doing the same type of thing that I've done previously. So, and in animal groups, what often happens is if some alpha male becomes too oppressive for the group, they will get 2 or 3 of the younger guys who have had enough of this, and they gang up together on the aging alpha male, and the 3 of them depose of him. So this happens, this is social behavior in animal models, including primates. Now, in humans, it's a little bit different because although some, well, let's say in monarchy, some monarchies and some dictatorships, the alpha people, male or female, don't show any mercy, any understanding, anything like that. But you don't usually find that even the most oppressive king is the executioner for the country. They have somebody else doing it. So in human social hierarchies, there is a combination of the power motive and social skills in addition to the aggression, because in humans, the way you achieve power is you get people to follow you, a majority in a democracy, or enough thugs in a totalitarian regime. And so, but it can't be simply aggression. You have to use a little bit of social finesse, often to con people. And so there has to be some inhibitor, some break to the testosterone and dopamine. And in humans, that is served by serotonin. So what differentiates the Don from the button man, they're both aggressive, but the Don has more serotonin to say, hey, wait, I want to get this guy. I'm not going to just yell and scream at him and threaten his life. I will make sure that I have enough support in the group and all of that. And once I have all of my ducks in line, that's when we'll get rid of him. And they will get rid of him, not me. So that's where the serotonin comes into play. And okay, so I have worked that in, so we don't have to repeat that. And decision-making is based on the strength and speed of the totality of the informational complex that reaches an activation threshold. And impulsive thinking, which is people who are impulsive rarely rise to prominent levels in social hierarchies, be they informal or formal, because you don't want to follow a guy who is just, thinking off the top of his head, makes very bad decisions, because people realize that will not take us where we want to go. So, and it results from thinking that doesn't take all of the factors into account, just what's emotional or sometimes motivational. Now, this, I'm not going to go through this, but this is a Next slide, there you go. This is a decision-making model based on pharmacology from a paper I published in 2011. It's in the Journal of Gambling Studies. And if anybody wants the reference, I can give it to them. But this is, by the way, is an oversimplification because there are, since 2011, there have been at least 3 more neurohormones that have been identified as playing a role in the decision-making process for drugs, for problem gambling, for pretty much anything in life that'll make you feel good. So I won't go through that, but you can see there's dopamine and testosterone and serotonin down here, and there are others involved as well. So my point in showing you this is just that it's a very complex system. So getting back to emotions, what extremists have always done is they have used some emotions to essentially, like they induce the emotions in people, and they have a specific purpose in activating or inhibiting behavior. So if you make people afraid, we know that when we're afraid, the first response is to freeze, right? And so that is inhibition. So fear is, they will induce fear to get people to stop, to terminate whatever behavior, like opposition to them, that they don't want. Anger, this is where they want people to aggress against some other group. And so they get people, they use propaganda and other techniques to make people angry about some identifiable group. And that helps to incite aggression towards the selective target. Disgust is used to remove inhibitions against the target that the instigator seeks to eliminate. And one of the major things about emotions is that they short circuit the pathway between cognition and decision making. And so that, you know, it's sort of a truism that if you're in a very emotional state, it's not a good time to make a serious life decision. Should I marry this person? Should I not? Should I invest $1 million in this stock or not? If you're really upset about anything, you're not going to think clearly, because your attentional resources have been co-opted by the strong emotions, and you have fewer cognitive resources to do the processing. So if you think about the left has an expression, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so this is one, and we'll see that this is one of the tactics that they use. So that brings us to, how do we, given all of this, so this was all just background from where we want to go now. How can we redefine extremism in such a way that we can actually work with it? Because although people have done magnificent work in documenting all sorts of extremism, not only anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism, there are libraries full of documentation of anti-Semitism, especially over the last 2,000 years, and perhaps most consequentially with Holocaust studies. But one of the things that I think brings us all here in all of these efforts is that despite this massive effort, anti-Semitism keeps rising. And so I think that simply documenting it, while it is very necessary, because if you can't show that it exists, why are you bothering talking about it? So I think that is a very necessary, worthwhile step. But I think that we have to be strategic in what we do with that information, how we understand what will work to move the needle with the other side. And I'm not saying that my solution, everybody will go out here, write a letter using whatever you've learned in this seminar, will solve the problem. But I think it should get us thinking about strategic thinking to actually counter the psychology that is being used against the Western world, Jews and Israel. And so given these psychological realities and mechanisms, I think that the way to look at extremism is to redefine it in terms of information processing. And as we discussed briefly at the beginning, almost everything meaningful in life results from a complex system with many interacting nodes in the system. So let's take the human body. For somebody to be healthy, the liver has to do its thing, the kidneys its thing, the brain, the heart, the lymphatics, and all of that. And as medicine has shown, they all interact with each other. Now, if you had a physician who said, well, I'm only going to deal with the liver, and I don't care, I'm going to give a drug, and I don't care if the drug that will cure the liver problem this patient has destroys the brain. It doesn't matter. The liver will be better. Well, that's obviously not going to work because the brain controls hormonal systems and immune systems in subtle ways, and that will affect the whole body. So it's a complex system. And if you only focus on one thing, as we saw in the beginning with the equations and with Mona Lisa, you're not going to come up, you cannot come up with a viable solution to a real world problem. And the extremist ideologies always focus on one or a very limited subset of the entire nodal array that makes the system work. And that's why no extremist solution, and I don't care whether it's Marxist or the globalists or feudalism or what have you, they cannot solve the problems that they set out to because they don't address enough of the nodes in the operating system. That being the case, what is it about people who are drawn to extremist ideologies? Well, there is empirical psychological evidence that's going on, some of it in Cambridge, some of it a colleague and friend of mine, Peter Sudfeld, at UBC. People who are drawn to extremist ideologies have sort of an aversion to complexity. It doesn't have to do, it's not intelligence per se, but they just don't like to have to think about complexities. They like a yes, no, black, white, up, down, dichotomous type of thinking. That is what they prefer, and that is what they're drawn to. So there's actually a resonance between the simplicity that the ideological movements have presented, and not everybody, but a sizable proportion of people. And the other problem is that being that they don't really like complexity, when they are fed some nonsense that just sounds good, they don't want to stop and think, does this really make any sense? Or where is it going to lead? And, where's the trajectory? And where are we going to be in 5 years if we close farms to save the planet from nitrogen fertilizers? Where are we going to be? So I'm suggesting that this is what the resonance is between the two. So I may have, let me see if okay. All right, so I think we did that. So what is the ultimate extremist political goal? Well, the extremists really, what they live for is power. And they use all sorts of techniques to achieve power, but that is the bottom line. It is not to better the world. It is not to better the country, the company, or whatever organization they are in. They want power over others. And one thing that you notice about all extremists is that they try to silence any contrary opinion, right? And it doesn't matter which, the Nazis did it, the Romans did it, the Greeks did it, the Egyptians did it, and the left does it, the globalists do it, and today the term is cancel culture. And I think the reason for that is that if you actually believe that what you have to say is true, you don't, and you value truth, then you don't care if somebody asks you a question because you believe that you can answer it. So ask away. Now, if you believe that you really don't have the answer and your identity is tied up very closely with the ideology, you don't want anybody to ask a question because you won't have an answer for it, because your system can't work by definition, because it doesn't look at broad enough set of variables. So you're going to wind up being wrong. And since their identity is so tied up in the ideology, it means that their identity will be destroyed. So what the ultimate extremist political goal is that they want to target opposing political systems, religious systems, social systems, and get the people in those targeted regions to have a break, have a negative response to their own traditions, values, and all of that, and work in concert with the extremist ideology to destroy the successful system from within, because they realize that if they were at all honest, I mean, if Marxists came along, 100 years ago and said, you know what we want to do? We want to make things worse for the working class and the peasants than it was under feudalism and the czars. And we're doing this to achieve power. Well, the revolution would have been stillborn, obviously. So what do they say? They say, no, we care about the people, and it's the really nasty bourgeois, and they're taking everything, and the poor worker is nothing. And so that's what they do to drive a wedge between the individuals and the systems that they have lived by. So where am I on time? 5 minutes. And there is a very nice article called Russian Hybrid Warfare by Clark in 2020. Maybe next week I'll go into the Chinese version of this, which is Total War, which was, it's been around for a long time, but of course, as time goes on, the actual targets change and the methods change, but the basic idea is still always the same: destroy the enemy from within. And especially since the nuclear age dawned in the late 40s, early 50s, everybody, aside from the Ayatollahs, realized that a nuclear war was not a viable option because nobody would win, nobody would survive. So the way to achieve dominance is destroy the other from within. And I will go into the next week, the techniques that have been employed, the strategies and the tactics using these strategies. All right, so I think I will stop there. And why is anti-Semitism critically important today? Like I started the talk with, I had two anti-Semitic incidents in the first 72 years of my life in Canada. And what is happening today is very different. And that's why it is critical today to understand this. So thank you very much, both the people who have stuck it out for an extra half hour here tonight, and everybody who is listening on the webinars. And I will hand it over to Andrea.
Thank you. I don't think we're going to have time for questions this evening. I'd like to call on Goldie Steiner to come up. Goldie is the co-chair and actually founder of the Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. And I'd like her to come up to acknowledge Dr. Nussbaum, and thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sorry that we didn't have enough time to go through all of it tonight.
No, the other half is for next week. So that was by design.
Okay, good.
That's fine.
Hello, everyone. And I guess, you know, on me, I'm Goldie Steiner. I know basically all of you. On behalf of CAEF and CILR, we want to thank you for coming out to this lecture and want to remind you that there is a follow-up on the 6th of July on Zoom. I also want to thank all the people who have attended, all of you who have heard this lecture. I'm sure you will walk away with a better understanding, at least of philosophy and psychology. And David, you promised us a lecture on sexism, what brought me out. You'll have to fill me up on that. Instead, you delivered a high-level psychology crash course. So we thank you for saving us the cost of a full-term university class. And thank you for coming. Thank you for doing this for us. And as a personal friend, I'm delighted to have you here.
I would like to thank you very much, Goldie, for your friendship over the years and your inspiration. I don't think you have to thank me for the talk. The reality is that we are all in this together, and not only Jews, but the Western world, people who live in democracies who unfortunately are not aware of what is going on behind the scenes. And so, like I say, we're all in this together. So I hope that people will think about what I said. I may have made mistakes, and if so, I'm very willing to consider revisions, because revisions get us closer to the truth. So anyway.
Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. On July the 6th, we will have a webinar when Dr. Nussbaum is back in Jerusalem, and everybody will be sent a notice. If you haven't registered, you still have time to do so. Thank you, and get home safely tonight.